and welcome to the first session of the day. Thanks for taking the time to make it here for kickoff. I've been told by Dan that we're on a fairly strict 40-minute clock, which has now already started, so I'm keen to get stuck straight into it and not waste too much time. So welcome to our three panelists, to Rebecca, to Juliet, and to Jordan. We obviously heard from Alex a flavour of some of the top-tier talent represented by our three panellists and their respective agencies. From Rachel Blackmore to Johnny Bairstow to Alfonso Davies to Nikita Paris and more. And I know, working with the three of them, that between them they've worked on some of the cutting-edge partnerships and campaigns throughout numerous different sports involving athletes and global brands in recent years. So there's a lot I want to ask them about and get their view on. As we go along, if you have things you'd like to ask our three panelists, please give that some thought. We're going to set aside a little bit of time at the end for Q&A, so don't be shy, and we'll be opening it up to the floor for the last 5 or 10 minutes or so. So, athlete and brand partnerships. Rebecca, starting with you perhaps. From your perspective, when it comes to the partnership between an athlete and a brand, and this could obviously be in the context of all the amazing work you've done with Rachel Blackmore in recent years, but I guess more broadly as well, what are some of the key drivers for you when you're trying to find that perfect fit? And I guess how does that then feed into the wider commercial strategy that you might try and create for a particular athlete?
Straight into the hot seat. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a cliche and it's a bit of a buzzword, but like authenticity is at the central part of every single partnership that we do. Ultimately, our goal is to build like long-term partnerships for our clients with brands that reflect their values and complement each other. And I actually think a lot of the time, athletes don't really know what they stand for or what their own values are until they sit down. And like, I suppose that's what our job is. And it's like, they're just like people, like everyone here in the room. Like we always go about our day job, but when you actually sit down and put on paper, you know, what you stand for, what your values are, what you're interested in away from sport, it's really interesting. And actually people find it really difficult. But I mean, that's what I do with my clients. Like every 6 months or so, we sit down, I have the same kind of list of questions, and like that can evolve over time. But really, there's no one size fits all. Like every athlete is unique and individual, and really knowing the athlete, what they're comfortable in, where their strengths are, what they're happy to speak out about, what their passions are in sport, outside of sport. And then obviously coming from a marketing background, like businesses are very good at telling you what they stand for. So really it's just a case of joining the dots. But there's so much thought that goes into it. Like, I don't know if it's the Irish in me, we're quite skeptic, but like as soon as you look at a partnership and you wonder how much someone got paid for it, like red flag. You want it to be so simple, but like I suppose the joy is in that it's so obvious and that the brand and the athlete just mesh together really well.
Yeah, and is that a constant kind of reevaluating process? I mean, if you think of all of the success that, for example, Rachel Blackmore's had in the last couple of years, presumably you have to constantly be reevaluating what that strategy is, what are the core values. Meanwhile, she's, you know, her career is going from strength to strength, obviously, but is it a constant kind of process?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, like you can see the trends and the patterns that emerge, like people's personalities. Some people are more introverted and don't like being on social media. Some people love it. Some people love creating content. So it is really different. And I think even people can change like we do, like you mature, but your values ultimately stay the same, you know? So I think at the core of all those documents, the grounding is still there. Interest might come and go, but really, you know, taking a stance on whether it's alcohol, betting, you know, it's always different, and it's different from person to person. But I think at the core, it really actually does stay the same.
Yeah. And Juliet, from your perspective and being engaged, obviously Rebecca mentioned authenticity being that kind of core foundation of any partnership. So much of the amazing kind of groundbreaking work that your agency has done has a real creative element to it. So how do you kind of approach creativity yet authenticity at the same time?
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. I definitely agree with the authenticity point, like really just leaning into what your clients' interests are, what their passions are, and not only in the kind of brands that they're partnering with, but how we're activating them. So I kind of like, we all know how important TikTok is at the moment for really like engaging with that large Gen Z audience. For a client like Alfonso, this is a dream. Like, he's super extrovert. He loves making content. He loves making music. Some of you may have seen like the kind of celebration post that he did around Bayern Munich winning the Champions League, or Canada qualifying for the World Cup, for example. So we always try and like incorporate TikTok into his brand conversations, and this makes like total sense. But for other clients, like, this is just like something that we wouldn't necessarily recommend at all. And then actually talking about the sort of constantly changing perspective versus staying consistent. Like, I'd love to talk about the example of, you know, Hector Bellerin and how he became sort of the global face of H&M and managed to create a sustainable collection with H&M. I'd say actually this kind of came from more of a like consistent messaging and narrative, and you know, took years for him to become like and be convinced to be a serious player in the fashion space. You know, walking on the catwalk for Louis Vuitton, or being the face of GQ, and also taken seriously as, you know, a voice for environmentalism. So switching to a vegan diet, for example, or, you know, turning down multiple brand deals where the brands didn't necessarily meet his ethical standard. So I'd say there's sort of like a fine line between, you know, constantly evaluating, but also sticking to a narrative and building out that strategy.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you make there about Hector, because one of the questions I had was, are we now seeing a little bit of a shift towards athletes being more comfortable showing their personality, showing their vulnerabilities, being prepared to kind of speak out about the passions and the causes that they really care about? Is that something you've seen kind of evolve in recent years?
Yeah, I think it's something that's definitely become more expected. And, you know, going back to the authenticity point, it's like you just have to kind of lean into your own personality and interests, and not everyone has to stand for everything, you know. Like, if you look at our roster, you've got, you know, Kai, who speaks out very much about animal welfare, and he's the ambassador of a donkey sanctuary. You've got Alfonso, who, as a former refugee, this is kind of like his vulnerability, and he talks a lot about the refugee work that he does. You know, Hector, obviously, sustainability and fashion, and Serge, like, I mean, he spoke out recently about toxic masculinity in Germany. So it's kind of like everyone leaning into something different that feels, you know, authentic to themselves, but not everyone standing for everything.
I mean, there's so many brilliant case studies there, and we'll hopefully sort of delve into some of them later. Jordan, from your side, obviously at CSM, I think your perspective is fascinating, because you obviously sit on the athlete representation side of the business, but also sometimes you'll wear a brand hat as well. So what's your kind of approach and philosophy to kind of some of the things that Juliet and Rebecca were saying?
Yeah, I think it's a real privilege to be able to see it from both points of view, and hopefully one feeds into the other quite nicely. So when I'm trying to sell an athlete into a brand, hopefully I've got a bit of an inside scoop on what they're looking for. And I think the athlete activism area is particularly interesting, and almost that expectation for them to stand for something or to have a kind of greater purpose. And I think I'd argue that sports always had that lens of being a platform for kind of driving change, but it's just this era of social media has allowed that to extend beyond those that are just on top of podiums or the kind of most media-worthy athletes, right down to kind of like you're getting kind of League One championship footballers that are able to have their own platform, build a voice, kind of talk that align and fit with that. And I think that's something that's really interesting and coming to the forefront, that you don't have to be some megastar, you can stand for something and kind of use that as a platform. And I think that's where social media has become interesting, and it's just allowed a greater range of athletes to have a voice and to kind of speak whatever that might be. And the other thing that we're trying to untangle at the moment is, I think Juliet alluded to perfectly, is not all athletes or all talent have to be all things to all people. And especially when we sit down with younger athletes, they tend to get caught up in thinking they have to be that, and they have to talk about everything to everyone, and they have to please everyone. And the reality is you're never going to please everyone. So it's okay just to kind of stick to the thing that interests you. Like Rebecca was saying, like, we all sit here and we know what we enjoy doing at the weekends and who we are as people and what is important to us. So it's, stripping them back down to the human beings that they are. They have their sport and they have their kind of, that's their day job, if you like, and then how we build around that and keep it authentic. And I think sometimes as well, we all dream of these partnerships that are authentic and they feed into these kind of greater purposes, and we all look at it and don't think about the money, but then we've worked with athletes sometimes and the purpose of the partnership is to make them money. Like, some athletes aren't in the privileged position to be earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a week, and sometimes commercial partnerships certain things, sometimes it just strips down to the basics of I need to pay my bills so I can keep doing the sport that I love. So purpose for different athletes is different things. So it's just feeding into those things, really.
And I'd love to add to that sort of the rise of athletes standing for something and the challenges that kind of we face as agencies around this. And like in a dream scenario, you've got a brand and an athlete and they stand for something very similar and have shared values. But I think we also need to be super conscious, like, and I know this is such a buzzword, but of sport washing, and is, you know, that brand using the athlete to kind of communicate initiatives that they don't necessarily stand for or have done anything about. So yeah, just, I know, Johnny, you know this better than anyone with the kind of H&M contract and all the back and forth that you guys did to make sure that there was a clause in the contract that it could be terminated if H&M or anything came out about H&M that meant that they didn't share the same level of like sustainable values that Hector does.
Someone's just won a sweepstake for the first time that sport washing was mentioned today in 13 minutes, I think it was. I want to touch on a point that has kind of threaded through a number of the points being made, which is the balance between an athlete's on profile and then their focus on athletic performance. And it's obviously it's a source of much debate in the industry that we're in, and I'm sure you all have views on that. But Jordan, from your perspective, how delicate a balance is it to strike when it comes to an athlete trying to take ownership of their social brand, cultivating their own audience? And obviously we have this incredible new generation of athletes that can connect directly to their audience very powerfully through social. But at the same time, we obviously have the need for that not to distract from on-field performance. So how do you kind of factor in all of those competing objectives?
Yeah, I think it goes right back to what Rebecca was saying. It's like every athlete is different, and I think that's when it becomes a lazy narrative, is when the same kind of broad brushstrokes are used to kind of talk about all players or all athletes, because what's too much for one person is exactly what another person needs. So for example, we work with Memphis Depay, and he's got a lot of energy and he needs to channel that somewhere. So he's got his own clothing brand, he's got his own foundation, he makes his own music, to some people's tastes, not to others, but he needs to be busy off the pitch, he needs to be channeling that creativity somewhere, and that's what's right for him. But then you might have another athlete where they need to focus on their sport, they need to be kind of like thinking strategies through, they might be like more introverted, and that might not be what works for them. So it's hard not to touch on this subject without talking about Emma Raducanu. The interesting thing for her is that she's new to all this, she's never been in this position before, so not even she knows what's too much for her. And so that's where I think there's trying to figure that out. Memphis has been playing football for a long time. He now knows what works for him, and he knows where he needs to be when he's kind of got his downtime and what he needs to be doing, and that takes time. And so I think there is a balance, but also that balance needs to be found out and needs to be worked on. I can't honestly sit here and say if Porsche were knocking at my door offering me a deal, I'd say no. So I don't know, where do you draw the line? So I'm not sure. I know Hector kind of had a bit of this when he was at Arsenal, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I'd say kind of timing is super important. Like, you've got a window when somebody's, you know, won a huge competition or is performing really well, and that's maybe the time to post or to do these kinds of things. And, you know, you just have to stay sensitive to what's happening on field or on the pitch. I mean, we've been working on a year-long project for one of our athletes that we'd love to post about, and the timing hasn't been right because of performance on the pitch. So I think it's just, being sensitive to that and not being sort of trigger happy.
I assume all of that is really important for you, Rebecca?
Yeah, I take a pretty cutthroat stance on it. I think the more athletes can understand the commercial side, like the better. Like I always try to explain decisions that I make or advice that I give so that the athlete can understand, like, ultimately on-field performance drives off-field opportunities, and depending on stages of careers and all that, but like performance always has to come first, like in the top years, in the beginning years. Like without that like sport is so cutthroat, like you're hot or you're not, you're in the team or you're not in the team. And like there's some of my clients that, like, you know, Porsche knocking on the door, they'd love that every other day of the year, but if they knock on the door on the wrong day of the year, they'll say no, because they know that they have such a short window to compete at the top. And if you do it right, Porsche will be knocking on the door in 10 years' time. You know what I mean? Like, really, it's about longevity, and it's about building a legacy, performing at your best, like getting to the end of the career and like having no regrets. And I think influencers have really challenged athletes. Like, the game has changed so much in the past 8 years. There's people now that are, influencers get paid to make content and to post, and that's put a bit of pressure on athletes, where maybe deals that would have traditionally gone to sports people, brands now have a bit of a choice and can look further afield. But at the same time, an athlete that's performing well and that has a solid brand will win every time. So like, for me, like, performance is central to everything.
Yeah, and just to Jordan's point on Emma Raducanu, it's obviously a very topical subject, which kind of a lot of people are adding their views and tuppence worth on. Where do you stand on, I guess, just the sheer level of scrutiny that she is under, both from an on-court perspective, but also in terms of her wider commercial activity as well? She's obviously had incredible levels of success very, very early on in her career. She's still a very, very young person and a young athlete. How do you stand in terms of trying to navigate through all of that noise?
She's so young. Like, what she did was incredible. Like, obviously everyone in here works in sports, so we can appreciate, like, what she did last year. The odds of that were freaking insane, and she ticks every box. Like, she's a marketer's dream. Like, God, I'd only love to be working with her. But at the same time, she's so young. Like, she has the world at her feet. Like, tennis is a grueling sport. Like, it's a pretty lonely sport. There's a lot of travel involved. Like, who knows if she even like, she's very academic from what I know. Like, who knows if she wants to be competing for the next, I don't even think she really knows what she wants. And to be honest, that's why it's so important to have a team around you. Like, you see it now, athletes don't just have a sporting agent, or they have a commercial, you know what I mean? It's important to have people with skill sets that are masters at what they do. There's not one person that looks after all of that. So there could be a bit of miscommunication between her commercial person and her coach, or maybe she's been through a couple of coaches, but it's really hard. And I think the interview she did at Wimbledon last week, she got lambasted for that. And really, if you watch it live, like, she's so young, and she doesn't really, you know, on paper things look much worse. As we all know, there's sometimes quotes that athletes can say that you wake up the next morning and you're like, Jesus Christ. But it's not, it's sometimes they're taken out of context, you know. And with her, I do think we all just need to cool the jets a little bit and remember how young she is.
And maybe beyond the Emma Raducanu conversation, but playing into kind of criticism off the pitch, I think we need to, like, ask ourselves, are some things more criticised than others? If any of you heard Hector on Jake Humphrey's podcast, he talks about how some of his teammates maybe would go home after training and spend 5 or 6 hours gaming, and this is never criticised. But if he was to go to an art gallery or a fashion week, it would be a lot more heavily scrutinised. And so I think it's about sort of revolutionising our industry and making things and different avenues and different passions and hobbies as accepted as others.
Yeah, and Jordan, how do you find working with kind of some of the really young athletes that obviously Rebecca mentioned in the context of Emma Raducanu, and dealing with kind of the level of scrutiny that they have on them, both in terms of their on-field performance, but I guess their lives more generally?
Yeah, I think it's a case of just reminding them that they have time. It's like, no one wants to hear, like, you're young, you've got loads of time, but, like, just, like, say, focus on that performance. I think we just lean into the examples of those athletes that we all see that have now transcended their sports, and the one thing they have in common is just sustained performance. Like, no one remembers the brand deals they did or didn't do, or who they were partnered with when, unless it's us lot who actually care about that stuff. But in general, people remember them for their performance and for their success in their sport. So it is just bringing them back to that and reminding them of that. And I think reminding them that the reason we're here and the reason they have a team is that it's our job to worry about that, so that they can focus on things on the pitch or the court or wherever it might be. And again, I keep saying it, but it is different for every athlete. Like, some of the athletes want to take complete ownership of their social media. They want to be posting, they want to be interacting with fans, like, they love it. Others are like, I don't want anything to do with it. Here, have my logins and just like post what I need to post just to keep whoever needs to be kept happy. So it's it's a real mix, and I think it's just really knowing your clients, like spending time with them, sitting down, like, and just understanding what they want, what interests them. Because again, going back to someone like Memphis, he's got a partnership with Red Bull, and he loves it. Like, it feeds into his music side of things, it feeds into the kind of youth grassroots side of things, like, that he can work through his charity. Like, it ticks all the boxes for him, and he just posts about it constantly. And so it's not one of these ones where sometimes you have to kind of give a bit of, please can you give this brand a bit of love, because we need to kind of fulfill those kind of contractual agreements or whatever. So those are the great ones, when it's kind of just it just happens. But it's case by case.
I want to ask each of you about, I guess, the role that women's sport ambassadors are playing and are continuing to play in breaking down barriers and kind of taking the exposure of women's sport to a whole new level. And Juliet, I want to ask you about kind of women's football and how significant, obviously the Euros kicking off this week, could be for women's football and the role of ambassadors in that context. But maybe starting with you, Rebecca, there's probably no better starting point when we're having a conversation about women's sport ambassadors than looking at what Rachel has kind of done for not just her sport, but also women's sport in Ireland and beyond in the last couple of years. How do you kind of put that into some sort of context when you look at how significant her kind of achievements have been?
Yeah, I think her case is like particularly unique because she's obviously competing on the same field as men, and like that just doesn't happen in sport. So yeah, I mean, it is crazy. Like, it is crazy, I think, being so close to it, and even seeing her arriving at Cheltenham or at Aintree, and just kids, like boys, girls, dads, granddads, like, she just resonates with everyone, which is like really strange. Like, usually you find the niche and you go after that target market, whereas with her story is just so inspiring, and so many people relate and engage with her. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, sponsorship and commercial and sport, like, it all comes down to numbers, and we've seen, like, even how far the women's game has come in football. Like, performance is getting better, more sponsors are coming on board, but I suppose it really is this generation now that are going to do the groundwork for hopefully a level play. It takes time. Like, the numbers have to keep coming up, the participation has to keep coming up, the fans have to keep, and it's growing, and it will get there, but it's taking time. But yeah, God, we're so lucky to have athletes like Rachel Blackmore, Katie Taylor, like, just doing things that no one's done before. Like, it was a matter of time, but God, it takes some amount of hard work and thick skin and a drive and determination that's, hopefully we'll get to a point one day where everything's equal, but it's going to take time.
Yeah. It's interesting that Rachel's had this incredible success over the last number of years, but hasn't necessarily relied on social media in the same way that other maybe women's sport ambassadors have, and we can come on to that, or sporting ambassadors generally. Tell us a little bit about kind of the thought process there, because we've obviously talked about the need to be true to your personality and your values, but at the same time, social media presents this incredible opportunity for athletes to connect with an audience. So how does that factor in for Rachel?
Yeah, do you know what? I think I was like the biggest campaigner of have social media, it's your own billboard, put on there, what, you know what I mean? Like, draw people to you, like, do inbound marketing, tell people what you stand for, be good, and the brands will start coming to you. And then Rachel just rocked up and is allergic to it. So yeah, had to rethink my position on that. But look, she's unique, like, and she's so great to work with because she knows what she stands for and she won't change for anyone. And in a way, you know, social media, in the beginning, it was very authentic and people were running the stuff themselves, and now you've got athletes that obviously don't run it themselves, but everyone's different, you know, like Ronaldo, people just want to know they don't care if it's a team of 10 people posting on it. People just want to hear from him. They want to be updated, you know, they want to see scores or whatever. But for me, I'm like, if I'm going to be the one posting on it, she just hate that, you know. So she's in this really weird situation now where, because information on her is people seek her out, you know what I mean? She doesn't have to impose herself onto people, and from a branding perspective, like, she sits very tidily and with a lot of corporate and B2B brands, and it's where she does really strongly, you know. So yeah, in the beginning, God, I would have loved to have wheeled her out, and I could think of millions of things that I'd want to do with her, but in a really nice way now. Like, for me, partnerships are all about storytelling, you know, and either the brand is going to tell the story of the athlete, or else the athlete's going to tell a story or an initiative of a brand. So with her, she like sits in this really weird space where brands want to come on board and give people more information about her. And then they also want her to be up on their website or on their channel. So she's kind of like, what's rare is wonderful.
And just very quickly, is it true that her Instagram blue tick verification request still has not been
Johnny,
accepted?
that's offside. Yeah, if anyone in here knows anyone on Instagram or Facebook, please come find me.
Here? I mean, she's in good company. Daniel G is still waiting for his Twitter blue tick verification as well. 3 years, I think it is. Just going back to, I guess, women's football in particular, Juliet, and Jordan as well. Euros kicking off this week. Women's football, particularly in the UK, is kind of riding a bit of a crest of a wave. Tell us a bit about how you see things from the inside.
Yeah, of course. So we represent Nikita Parrish. She's playing for England, kicking off tomorrow at the Women's Euros. And I'd say her brand partners have been like incredibly influential in helping raising her profile and the profile of women's football in general. So she's partnered with Visa, with Pandora, with Pepsi, with McDonald's. And all of these have, done such a great job in creating great content with Nikita and raising her profile. But what I'd love to see is a moment, and maybe this will come after the Euros, but where brands are partnering with the female footballers, just like kind of as ambassadors themselves, because if we think about all the partners that Nikita has, yes, amazing blue chip brands, but they're all currently sponsoring or partnering with federations, competitions, or clubs, and working with Nikita to amplify those partnerships. So I'd love to see a time when, you know, people are going to the athletes first.
Yeah. And what does it take to get to that point, do you think? I don't know if you have any thoughts, Jordan?
I think time, as we've all said, and if they could win the Euros, that would really help. So no pressure, but I think it feels like that tipping point, right? So Nike did a really cool campaign yesterday, I think it was, where they were projecting images of the players onto kind of big iconic landmarks throughout London, and it's that almost switch where they're on iconic landmarks, and now these players are almost becoming icons in their own right, and so brands have stepped up and they're trying to elevate the game. It's not entirely selfish because they know that at some point it's going to tip and that's going to benefit them, and those players are going to elevate them. So I think with all things, it's time, it's success, and personally I'm really excited for the kind of, no disrespect to the current roster of players, but the next generation that comes through. I grew up playing football, or at least attempting to, and there was none of these kind of icons to hugely look up to, or certainly not as a kind of career or prospect, or playing at Wembley, or any of these things that kind of inspire you when you're kind of like running around in the garden with your brothers playing football. It's always just kind of as a hobby, and I probably wasn't good enough either, but we'll put that to the side. But yeah, it's great to see that, and kind of hearing around the kind of resources that going into like the academies to the girls teams. And so I do think if I was kind of in the England setup and I was retiring in the next 2 or 3 years, I wouldn't be too sad about that, because I'd be pretty scared of the kind of 12, 13, 14-year-olds that are coming through the ranks, and they're quick, they're strong, they're powerful, they're very familiar with the social media. So I think that's when we're going to start to see big personalities coming out, the confidence, and yeah, hopefully some pretty cool ambassadors that brands can partner with.
And yeah, just to add to that, I think women's football has done a very good job at converting fans of men's football. Just looking at Nikita and Ella Toon's social audiences, we can see like 70% of their Instagram followers are fans of men's football, which I was kind of surprised by. But maybe, as you said, it's sort of this tipping point where we've kind of converted the fans of men's football, but now it's a time to, create an own identity for women's football and find, new fans and a new audience separate and standalone to men's football.
Yeah. I think Jordan's point is really interesting about what if England were to win the tournament and the hype around that, or Northern Ireland, who've qualified. Don't forget about them. But yeah, if that was to happen, and you talk about a tipping point, and you have this kind of moment of or defining moment in the growth of women's football, like how powerful would that on-field success then be in the context of the wider piece, do you think?
I think especially as it's a home Euros as well, like if it was to happen here, like we talk about sport in terms of iconic moments and memorable moments, and I think it would really kind of transcend the game, and I think it would take it right up to another level, because it would then become kind of just general household conversation. I think people start to notice the media would get really behind it, get really excited, and suddenly it would really kind of snowball, and like I'd love to see the viewing figures even when the England Lionesses get into the final. I think that would become a real special moment. And I think the bounce back from COVID, if we can call it that, has been quite phenomenal, just seeing how robust sport is as a prospect. Like, we're about to have our best year ever, and it's not even halfway through the year yet, because that appetite for sport, for those I was there moments, for those kind of like unique experiences, it just feels like a bit of a tidal wave. I mean, our hospitality team are selling Wimbledon tickets at the moment. I think they're having a bit of fun. So it's like the kind of craving for those moments. So I think in terms of timing as well, where people are just, they're looking to go on holiday, they're looking to kind of get in the pub with their friends and enjoy these sporting moments, I think it could be really powerful and a really important time of at least getting to the knockouts.
Yeah. I'm going to open it up to the floor in just a couple of minutes, so if you've got a question, sort of give it some thought in the next couple of minutes. But one of the things we're keen to do today in all of the masterclass sessions is, I guess, look ahead and kind of be future-facing around where the sports industry is going and the future trends down the track. And obviously we've got some interesting sessions coming up on, for example, the metaverse. But what I wanted to ask our three panelists is, in terms of new trends and exciting sectors, markets coming down the track in the athlete partnership space, is there anything that is jumping out for you? I know, Jordan, whenever we were speaking yesterday, you mentioned kind of the athlete investor model and how that's kind of becoming more normal now in comparison to the US, where it's been sort of in place for a number of years. But are there any other trends or thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I think increasingly now, like, athletes want skin in the game in partnerships. I think if the fit is right and the ambitions align, like, if it's going to be a long-term partnership, like what I'm seeing increasingly now is like, cash equity split, or athletes want to feel involved. They want to, it kind of incentivizes them to push things more if it's kind of coming full circle. Shane Lowry, for example, invested in a company called Wayflyer back in Ireland, who've now gone on to, I think they've become a unicorn, but he went out to the Masters with their branding, and they announced like their latest round of funding with him as the whole thing just made so much sense. An Irish company breaking the US, he went over to the Masters. Like, it's just things like that are so obvious, yet just kind of genius at the same time. So increasingly now athletes are looking for beyond just money in the bank. Like, they also want something to invest a bit of like energy and effort into, and sport's not forever. Like, what happens when they hang up the boots or whatever. So long term.
And kind of coming full circle, it goes back to the authenticity point, and a brand can really tell that a player cares about the brand if they're investing their own money into it. So it works kind of from both sides.
I think from the brand's point of view as well, it just opens up so many more possibilities, both for brands and for athletes, because you have to be a pretty successful or privileged brand to be able to fork out some of the money that is required to partner with some of these stars. So I know we worked with Usain Bolt recently on a deal with an esports team, and if it was kind of your typical model, it wouldn't have been feasible, but we were able to kind of think a bit outside the box. And I think that's where us as kind of advisors or agencies, it's on us to upskill ourselves and make sure that we've got the right advisors in place to make these types of deals happen where they can happen and where they make sense and where they align, because I do think the States is quite, the way they view athletes and the way they view partnerships feels a little bit more advanced, just working with some of my colleagues over in the US, but we've kind of come up against it sometimes over in Europe where if it's not, here's a check, and I think some of that potentially comes down to the intricacies of how agents get paid in deals, because if that's not easy, then maybe agents are less inclined to kind of pursue those deals. But I think as that kind of element starts to get unpacked, and if the agent themselves is viewing it as a long-term and they have long-term benefits to the partnership as well, I think we're going to start to see more and more of these. And I mean, we're even starting to see it kind of, lower down in terms of the profile of the players. Again, there's players that they could take kind of a few £1,000s to do a deal, or they could kind of be a bit more bought in, be a bit more invested, and the potential upside could be massive. And then that allows them long into retirement to have other business interests and various other elements to lean into. So yeah, in terms of future trends, it's something I'm trying to very much upskill myself on and understand a bit more, just to be able to kind of, lean in that direction, because I definitely don't want to be one of those people that shuts the door if it's not like a nice big check. So those are nice too, though.
Yeah. So we've got time for hopefully a couple of questions from the floor. I'm trying to see if we have someone with our roving mic appearing at the back. It's quite difficult to see. We've got a question near the front here, third row.
Yeah, I think Starling Bank are a recent one that have been doing some really cool stuff. So they've developed a like fantasy football app just around the women's game, because obviously the fantasy game in the Premier League and in the men's game is massive and super famous, and obviously kind of gets, even the players themselves are playing it and putting themselves in and out. So it's great to see a brand kind of try and develop in a slightly kind of more innovative way and kind of focus on the women's game and kind of elevating it and giving it its own platform alongside the men's, as we were talking about. So that'd be kind of an example I'd lean on that's happened recently.
I'd agree, and I'd add to that LinkedIn, who are sponsoring the Women's Euros and all the activation they've done around, like, women having equal rights and, women in football from a business point of view, but also on the pitch, which is pretty cool. And then you've got, like, more obvious examples, I'd say, like Pandora, who are also Women's Euro sponsors, and it's kind of more in the jewellery sector.
Apologies, I should have said, maybe if you're asking a question, just maybe give your name and introduce what company you're from as well. We have a question over this side of the room.
Alexis White, Press Like a Pro. I was just curious to know, to what extent are you reactive in real time to an athlete like Johnny Bairstow who's performing at the moment? Or would you, to what extent would you map out like a good, medium, bad performance across a test series? And to tag on to that, to what extent could that become an extra burden and pressure? Because I think you alluded to someone like you built up a campaign and you're going to push the button. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. I think Johnny Bairstow was mentioned.
Yeah, I can talk about Johnny, who is just hitting centuries of fun at the moment, which means a few more people are answering my calls, which is nice. Whereas, like, again, it all comes down to performance, and I don't think there's any shame in being reactive. Like, sport is a reactive thing, and these like unpredictable moments are what we kind of all live for. As much as I'd love to have predicted that Johnny was going to perform like this, but I think it's great, and you have to be reactive, and we have to be on our toes, and we have to be capitalising on these opportunities. And then obviously you have that undertone of knowing when they're performing, when those moments are likely to be. You kind of build those in, so you can have the best plan possible, but sometimes it can go exceedingly well, and then you're going to be like, okay, let's pick up the phone a few more times this week. It obviously has the flip side as well, where things can maybe not go to plan, and you maybe have to do a little bit of damage control. But yeah, I think, but it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but both is the answer. Don't know if you guys have anything to add. Yeah.
We have another question at this side of the room.
Hi, Brandon Myers. I'm actually a student. I'm not with it. Kind of similar to the questions that we've been asked. How do you deal with to lose brand value, whether that be performance or simply due to age, that comes to the end of their career, their kind of window of opportunities is so, as we know, is so, time is so little and precious for sport. What are the things that are important to think about when it comes to an athlete who perhaps is starting to lose a bit of brand value?
Yeah, the transition point is inevitable for every athlete at some stage. They are going to hang up their boots or whatever, and it's a really big duty of care. It's a massive part of our job, and yeah, it's inevitable. The brand value is it's a mountain, it's going to go up and it's probably going to come back down, but really that just shows the need for like having a plan in place, and you know, while they're playing, their profile is at the highest, so it's being proactive and, you know, planning ahead and figuring out what that next step is, like what they're driven by, what they want to do off the pitch, whether do they want to go into punditry, do they want to go into business, do they want to go, you know, and having those conversations while they're playing. I get given out to every time I bring it up, but it's so important because now's the time to sow those seeds, and I think if you do your job properly, you try to make it as seamless a transition as possible. Like you can't on one thing, you try to spread that out. And that's why, again, coming back to that thing of investing in businesses and working with them as well is also a really interesting play for athletes at the moment. So yeah, it's not really a conveyor belt, and once they get to the end of it, you just throw them off. Like it's very much it's a lot of responsibility working with someone, you know, but yeah, you have to love it.
I think we might have time for at least one more in the middle here.
Yeah, it's interesting, and as much as it depends on the athlete, it depends on the club as well, I'd argue. But I think they are becoming more open and understanding to it. Obviously, there's various elements around their own club partners and protecting those and making sure that they're first and foremost. And there's ultimately various grey areas depending on the kind of player's agreement with the club. But I do think on the whole, they're starting to understand and see the value that players can bring to them as a club, as an asset themselves. So there's an example I lean on quite a lot when we kind of talk about the power of the individual. And I think it was over 10 years, Watford's YouTube channel grew to like 170,000. Ben Foster got 1 million followers or subscribers within a month. And so if you're a club, in my opinion, you should see that as a positive and understand the power that the players can bring to your club, and there is a value to that as well. So I think with my experience at the moment is they are open to working and allowing kind of players within reason to work with brands and be a bit more kind of, collaborative in that sense. But Ronaldo's the other classic example where his following is, like, dwarfs any club that he's ever played for. And so it's kind of understanding that value of the player off pitch and how that can also drive value back into the club through those eyeballs. Because I think another trend that we've seen is people are starting to follow players. It doesn't matter what club they play for. If they've got a good personality, if they're interesting players to follow, if they're into kind of things that you're also interested in off the pitch, whether that be kind of esports and gaming or whatever it might be, people are following those players around, and therefore that player has an added value to just their ability on the pitch as well. So I think, in general, the clubs seem to be on board on the whole. Yeah,
I think from a more practical point of view as well, it's really important to be in communication with clubs and also letting their teams know what's in like you have to schedule certain things in, so there's no surprises.
We could probably continue on for another few hours talking about various things. I was keen to pick up on the Ronaldo point you made, but unfortunately I've been told that we're out of time. I'd just like to thank our three panellists for giving up their time today. I know they've got very busy schedules. They will, I think, be sticking around for the next few hours, so please feel free to grab them during the break and say hello. Please don't go anywhere. I'm going to hand over next to my colleague Nee, who's going to tell you about what's happening next, which is NFTs, the metaverse, and Web3 in sport. So don't go anywhere. But finally, I would ask you to please put your hands together for Rebecca, Juliet, and Jordan. Thank you.